The next of the Milesians is the philosopher Anaximander. Anaximander was a younger contemporary of Thales, and as in the case of Thales, we have only very fragmentary evidence to go on when judging Anaximander's thought. However, even though the number of fragments is just as scanty, you'll see in your book that the chapter on Anaximander is no longer than the chapter on Thales. We do get a much more complete picture. In this case, it's a picture of the makings of a complete cosmogony, a complete account of the origin of the earth and the origin of life. He talks about the earth, he talks about its size, he talks about the heavenly bodies, he talks about how the light of the stars reaches the earth, he talks about the origin and the growth of life on earth. He accompanies some of this with some interesting reasons. For example, you might note in one of the fragments that Anaximander says that human beings came originally from fish, and he has a reason for this as well. The human infant takes a long time to develop from infant to adult. An infant left to its own devices would not survive without adult parents around to take care of it. And therefore Anaximander reasons that the very first humans must have come from some non-human source. He believes they were born out of fish. Like Thales, Anaximander also proposes a arche, a first principle of all things. However, his arche is something different. He's not going along with water that Thales suggests. Rather, in the case of Anaximander, it is something that Anaximander calls the apeiron, which we may translate as the unlimited or the indefinite. That's which has no defined limits, form, or shape. Now, we might think about this, and think of some of the reasons that Anaximander would have had to reject the notion that the first principle of all things could be water. One thing we notice about Anaximander, which is common really to virtually all of the pre-Socratics, is that they conceive of change. One of the important things about the nature of this world that they're trying to come to an understanding of, change they conceive of as something that takes place between opposites. What's cold might become warm, what's warm becomes cold, what's wet can dry out, what's dry can become wet. So change is something that always happens between opposites. Now, anything that is something at all has very specific qualities. Specifically, if we're looking at any of the basic elements out of which things are made. The elements which, for the Greeks, were basically earth, air, fire, and water. Water is wet and cold. Fire is hot and dry. And if our starting point is a universe in which everything is water, and all there is wetness and coldness, what device, what mechanism could we imagine whereby the wet would be transformed into the dry if there is no external stimulus or force to make that happen, apart from wetness itself? And what would cause that to happen at one particular time rather than another particular time? So if we start with a first principle that is something of very defined qualities like water, it's not clear how we could affect the transformation into the other things that exist in the universe which might be opposed to that. Maybe Anaximander was thinking something along those lines. We don't really know. We're just speculating here. But the apeiron would certainly answer that kind of an objection. The apeiron is something that is not itself this or that. It is not defined as one thing rather than another thing. It is not in itself hot or cold or wet or dry. Rather, if anything, it is all of those things somehow mixed up homogeneously within itself. Anaximander said that the apeiron is something that is deathless. It has no beginning and it has no end. All things come out of it, all things go back into it. So unlike the specific things that exist in this world, that have specific properties and that can be definitely identified, all of those things that are constantly changing, that come into existence and that go out of existence, the source of all of those things is something that doesn't change. It just is the eternal, deathless, indefinite. One other thing that Anaximander says about the apeiron, he says, things that are perish into the things out of which they come to be, according to necessity, for they pay penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice in accordance with the ordering of time. So there's an order to the universe as well. Anaximander supposes that there's a specific order to the universe. Time is an important principle in regulating that order. And that order also is a moral order in some sense, because things that come into existence and go out of existence, they commit a kind of an injustice by coming into existence. So everything that exists as one thing rather than another thing is living on borrowed time, that it must give back. It must go back into that which isn't anything in specific, back to its source. I do want to remind you once more that how important it is that you carefully attend to and take time with the readings of all of your texts, reading and rereading. In philosophy, it is very important to read slow, think about what you've read, read it over again, and read it over again. And nothing can substitute for that exercise of engaging with the text in that way. In these brief little videos, I can only touch a few topics out of the readings that you're going to be doing for this class. I can only maybe unpack a few little things. I can't even touch upon all the questions that you're going to encounter there. So it's not a substitute for the readings. I hope that it will allow you to bring some more thoughts to the readings, to bring something to the text to think about as you look at these texts. But you're going to want to try to pull more of the texts that I'm able to give you here. And you're going to be thinking about, writing about, answering questions on the tests about things that I haven't talked with you about in these little videos. So this isn't a substitute for reading by any means. It's an inspiration to do your reading better than you otherwise would. So please pay close attention to those readings. So now let's move on to our third and final of the Milesians, Anaximenes. Anaximenes, not surprisingly, has yet another arche, and his arche is air. So we've gone from water to the indefinite to air. Well, if there were some issues with water because it was something determinate and well-defined and only one kind of thing, and that creates a problem for explaining change when change is a kind of transformation from one thing into its opposite, and if the indefinite is something that solves that problem, then when we see air coming up as the first principle for Anaximenes, it might look like it's a step backward. But take a close look at the fragments of Anaximenes and see if maybe there's something else going on there. There's more going on that it might look at first sight. See if his conception of air is something that could satisfy to the objections that we imagined Anaximander might have had against something specific like water being proposed as a first principle. Now we saw that the first principle of the apeiron, of the indefinite, does have the advantage that it doesn't specify a type of thing of definite qualities that make it then very difficult to explain how from this one stuff you could have transformation into all kinds of things, including things that are qualified in opposite ways than that one stuff is qualified. Okay? So we saw that that seemed to answer that sort of an objection. On the other hand, we could imagine some objections to the concept of the apeiron. After all, what is the apeiron? We don't know what it is. We can't really say anything about it. Almost by definition, it doesn't have any qualities. So it's almost like saying everything comes out of and goes back into the I don't know what in the world it is. So that doesn't seem very satisfactory as an explanation if the first principle of all our explanations is something that is in itself unknowable and unidentifiable.